Have you ever, like, really had an image stick with you? Something that just won't go away.
Oh, absolutely. Like a photograph or a piece of art that just grabs you.
Yeah, exactly. And the one that's been haunting me lately is from the stuff we've been digging into for this deep dive. It's that image of, well, a mother carefully, like really carefully scraping the last bits of rice from a pot.
Wow, yeah. That's powerful.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's stark. And it's the harsh reality that we're facing right here, right now. And this image comes straight from a personal story, really intense, on that Eco Nightmares YouTube
Oh,
channel.
I've seen some of their stuff. It can be pretty heavy.
No kidding.
Yeah.
But this one, it really hits home about how when the environment breaks down, even something as basic as, well, feeding yourself and your family becomes impossible.
And it's like it makes those big global environmental issues suddenly feel incredibly personal
Yeah.
and urgent.
Right. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in this deep dive. Get inside this one specific story, figure out how a village that used to be able to sustain itself, how they ended up facing this devastating food shortage.
And hopefully, pull out some lessons about what we can do, about how we need to change our relationship with the planet, really.
Absolutely. Real sustainability. Okay, so the story starts by describing a time before everything fell apart and the narrator just keeps saying, we used to have enough. What did you think was important about how they described that initial situation in the village?
I think what really struck me was that phrase. We used to have enough. Not much, but enough. Like that word enough, it really says it all, doesn't it?
I mean, they weren't living in luxury or anything.
Right. But there was this balance. They had a system that worked. The father, he grew all these different crops, cassava, maize, sweet potatoes. So they had variety, right?
In that kind of variety, it provides a safety net, right? If one crop fails.
Exactly. They weren't putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. And then you have the mother going to the market, trading fruits and stuff. So that gave them even more options, dried fish, oil, those kinds of things.
It really paints this picture of a community that was, well, they were connected to their environment. They could provide for their basic needs.
Yeah. Self-sufficient to a large extent, which makes what happens next even more, tragic.
And that's where the trucks come in, right? The beginning of deforestation. What are the things about those early days of the logging that we should really focus on?
So a few things. First, it wasn't like this sudden disaster. It was this gradual thing, almost sneaky, like a slow chipping away at the forest.
And people didn't really panic at first.
Not really. They were told, it's for new farms, for fuel, for businesses in the city, which, I mean, on the surface, it might have sounded reasonable.
Yeah, it's that classic thing, right? Short-term gain, long-term pain.
Exactly. And the narrator even says, it's just a few trees. The forest is big. It's like they just didn't grasp the bigger picture, how everything was connected.
But then they say, it didn't stop.
Yeah.
That's when things shift.
Yeah. It goes from a minor annoyance to this growing threat. And then, of course, all those serious environmental changes you were talking about, they start to kick in.
So as they kept cutting down the trees, it wasn't just the trees that were disappearing. It was, well, everything started to change. Can you unpack that for us? What were some of the biggest environmental impacts?
Well, think of it like this. In nature, everything's connected.
Yeah,
Right.
It's all a delicate balance.
Exactly. So when you take away the trees, you get this domino effect. The narrator, they talk about the land getting hotter. Well, that's because trees, they create shade, they cool things down, they release moisture, which also cools the air. No trees, you get a much hotter environment.
Makes sense.
And then the river starts shrinking, there's less fish. That's all about the water cycle getting messed up. See, trees, their roots hold the soil together. But without trees, when it rains, all that good topsoil just washes away, ends up in the river. So it's harder to grow anything, and the fish suffer too.
It's a chain reaction.
Right. And the rainfall becomes unpredictable. You get droughts, then suddenly floods. Again, that's because forests, they play a huge role in regulating rainfall. Lose the forest, you get these crazy weather swings.
And all of that directly impacts their ability to grow food.
It's the heart of the issue, right? Their self-sufficiency, it starts to crumble because the environment they depended on, it's falling apart.
So to deal with this, the father tries to adapt, right? He starts planting crops that can handle the drought. Did that work?
It was a smart move, definitely. But the story shows us that, adaptation has its limits.
In what way?
These drought-resistant crops, they take longer to grow. And the yield, how much food they actually produce, it's lower. So it's a Band-Aid solution.
It buys them some time, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem.
Exactly. And it makes them even more vulnerable because now they're relying on just a few types of crops.
And we see the consequences of this play out in the story. Rice prices skyrocket. The family's meals, they get smaller and smaller. It's heartbreaking. No more oil, no more meat. Breakfast is just tea for a while, and then even that disappears. It's just, I can't imagine.
It's this slow, agonizing decline, this insidious creep of famine. They're constantly having to make these terrible choices, cutting back on what they eat, what they can give their children. The mother keeps saying, we'll save it for later, but later never comes, does it?
No. They hold on to hope for as long as they can, but it's so sad. And these changes, they don't just impact the family, do they? The entire village suffers.
Absolutely. It's a community-wide crisis. The narrator talks about how everyone's kids are eating less, friends are dropping out of school. You can feel this whole community unraveling.
And the narrator's little brother, Daniel. His story is just devastating.
Yeah. Daniel's story really gets to you, doesn't it? You see the physical signs of malnutrition. His swollen belly, how thin he is. But it's the loss of his childhood that really gets me. He stops playing, he's not laughing anymore, and then he starts asking these heartbreaking questions. When will the trees come back? When will the land be healthy again?
You just want things to go back to normal.
It shows the human cost of this environmental destruction, how it ripples out and impacts everyone, especially the most vulnerable.
And then there's that moment when the father walks for 2 whole days to get to the market, only to find it completely empty. That's a powerful symbol of a system that's totally broken down.
It's not just their farm that's failed. The entire network, the way they get food, the way they survive, it's all collapsed. And there's nowhere to turn, no backup plan.
And they even consider leaving their home. It's a hard choice, leaving everything they know.
It shows how desperate the situation has become. They're willing to leave their home, their community, just to try and survive.
But they stay. And things continue to spiral downwards. Their health deteriorates. And eventually Daniel, he becomes too weak to even get up. And then he dies. I mean, how do you even process that?
It's such a tragedy. And what makes it even more difficult to accept is that this isn't an isolated incident, you know?
The narrator makes that point very clear.
It's happening all over the world in different ways. The examples they give, the famine in Somalia because of the droughts, farmland in Bangladesh being lost to rising sea levels, people in the U.S. relying more and more on food banks, crops failing in Canada due to extreme weather. It's this global pattern,
And it's not because the planet doesn't have enough resources.
Exactly. That's the key takeaway. The narrator says it perfectly. We have taken too much. We've cut down too many trees, polluted too much, wasted too much food.
There's this huge imbalance in how we're using the Earth's resources.
We've acted like the planet can just endlessly provide, but this story, it shows us the consequences of that mindset.
And then the narrator asks this question that just hangs in the air. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when the last tree is cut, the last river dries, and the last grain of rice is scraped from the pot?
Chilling, isn't it? It's like they've lived through that nightmare, and they're forcing us to confront it.
I mean, it makes it real.
Yeah.
It's not some abstract future problem. It's happening right now. And it all comes back to this core message of the Eco-Nightmares story. A healthy environment and access to food, they're two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. They're inseparable. And for you listening, this story, as tough as it is, it should make you think, about how interconnected everything is, from global ecosystems down to your own life and your own choices.
Because what we do, it has an impact. And that leads to the question, what can we actually do about it? It can feel overwhelming, right? But there are things we can do.
Yeah, I think it's important to focus on what we can control. Like, where does your food come from? Are you wasting food? Can you support businesses and farms that are doing things sustainably? Talk to your friends and family about these issues. Vote for politicians who prioritize the environment. These things, they might seem small, but when we all do them, it adds up.
We have more power than we think. And that brings us to the narrator's final thought, which is surprisingly hopeful, considering everything they've been through. They say they hope the world never does run out of food.
It's a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, there's still hope. We can still change course.
And so as you go about your day, think about that hope. Think about what you can do to make sure it becomes a reality for everyone.